Michael Jackson owned 50% of Sony. You'll hear and read this statement many times, sometimes followed by, "and that's why they killed him." Did Michael Jackson really own 50% of Sony? Is there any truth to that statement at all? Or is it just another music industry myth? When Michael Jackson died in 2009, it wasn't long before conspiracy theories around his death started to circulate. Not least of all that there was a secret plot to kill him because he'd become too powerful, due to owning 50% of Sony. One source being his own sister LaToya, apparently.
How do you think he died? You've been quoted as saying you believe it may have been murder. Do you still think that?
Absolutely.
Why?
Absolutely.
Why are you so sure?
I would never, ever think differently. Because first of all, Michael told me that they were going to murder him.
So did he own 50% of Sony? The short answer is no. He didn't at any point own 50% of Sony Corporation. But there is some truth to that myth. Now let me explain. Now most of you are familiar with who Michael Jackson is. But who exactly is Sony? Sony Corporation was founded in 1946 by Japanese research scientists Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuka. The two had met during World War II, when they both served in the Japanese Navy's Wartime Research Committee. They were working on a project developing infrared-guided bombs. Originally called Tokyo Tsujin Kogyo, or the Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation, the company grew from Ibuka's repair shop that operated on the third floor of the fire-damaged Shirokiya department store. Ibuka had previously tried to develop his own product, a rice cooker that proved unreliable, and after its failure, he decided to focus on audio products. The first product they released was a megaphone in 1947, followed by Japan's first magnetic tape machine in 1950. A few years later, on a trip to the US, Morita and Ibuka learned about transistors being developed by Bell Laboratories, and they wasted no time in securing a license to use the technology in their own products. Transistors are much smaller than the vacuum tubes previously used in the design of radios, and enabled the development of portable, even handheld radios. On their trips to the USA, they discovered that Americans struggled to pronounce the company's name, even by its abbreviated version, Totsuko. With a new desire to grow their company globally, they decided that a shorter, catchier brand name was needed. They chose Sony, based on the Latin word sonos, meaning sound, and it also sounded like sunny, which was a word used in Japan to describe ambitious and adventurous young men. The first Sony-branded product was the TR-55 transistor radio released in 1955, and it was an instant hit. The Sony brand proved popular, and in 1958, Tokyo Tsujin Kogyo officially changed its name to Sony. By the early 1960s, it established offices in the USA and in Europe, and over the next 20 years they developed myriad products: radios, tape recorders, televisions, and video recorders. Many of their products set new standards in the industry and broke new ground. In 1973, they were awarded an Emmy for their Sony Trinitron color TVs, the first Japanese company to win the award.
It's really true. Sony won an Emmy.
In 1979, they launched a personal compact cassette player that was marketed as the Soundabout in the USA and Stowaway in the UK. But now it's better known as the Walkman.
You really feel the music with the Sony Walkman.
The Sony Walkman is a tiny stereo cassette player with truly incredible sound.
You really feel the music. You really feel it. You really feel the music.
Put on a Walkman and see the world in a whole new light.
Sony Walkman.
The Walkman from Sony, the one and only.
In 1982, they launched the world's first compact disc player, followed a few years later by a portable version, the Discman.
Sony. Whatever will they think of next?
After securing the rights to use Apple's hard disk technology, in 1984 Sony moved into computers and quickly captured 20% of the Japanese market. Around this time they also started manufacturing components for other manufacturers, and this grew the company even further. By 1988 they'd grown from that small repair shop in the fire-damaged department store that'd been founded for just 190,000 yen, which is roughly $1,500 in today's money, to a global corporation worth $13 billion. In 1988, Sony Corporation bought CBS Records for $2 billion, and this is where their paths collide with Michael Jackson. Michael and his four brothers Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, and Marlon signed to Motown Records as the Jackson 5 in 1968, and over the following 7 years they released 10 studio albums, 24 singles, and they sold over 60 million records in total. During this time, Michael Jackson also released 4 solo albums on Motown, and began to establish himself as a solo artist. Despite earning Motown hundreds of millions of dollars over the years, the Jacksons themselves were getting a tiny fraction of this, due to the meagre 2.8% royalty rate they'd agreed when they first signed to the label. By 1976, the Jackson 5's popularity was declining. Only one of their last 10 singles released between 1971 and 1976 broke into the top 10, and they hadn't had a number one since the first 4 singles for Motown hit the top spot 7 years earlier. Unhappy with the money they were receiving from Motown, the Jacksons sued Motown over accounting irregularities and contractual obligations. Joe Jackson also began shopping around for a new deal for his sons. During the mid-1970s, Motown Records began its own decline. They left Detroit in 1972 to move operations to Los Angeles, with the aim of breaking into the movie industry, and many of their biggest artists such as Gladys Knight and the Pips, the Spinners, the Four Tops, and many of the legendary Motown session musicians known as the Funk Brothers, all decided to remain in Detroit or split from the label altogether. In 1976, with the Jacksons still embroiled in a contractual dispute with Motown Records, Joe Jackson announced that the Jackson 5 would be leaving the label to sign with CBS Records subsidiary Epic Records, with whom they'd agreed a 20% royalty rate. Not wanting to lose one of their biggest assets, Motown sued the group for breach of contract. It would take until 1980 to settle that dispute, but in the meantime Motown allowed them to record for Epic, providing they acknowledged that Motown owned the name the Jackson 5, and they would record under another name. Jermaine Jackson, who was now married to Motown founder Berry Gordy's daughter Hazel, stayed with the label and was replaced by Randy Jackson in the group of brothers that was now renamed simply the Jacksons. The Jacksons' releases on Epic re-established them as top-selling artists. Michael Jackson continued to make his name as a solo artist with his albums Off the Wall and the global smash hit record-breaking Thriller. Thriller was the biggest-selling album of all time and earned the artist an estimated $50 million in royalties. But it was the information that he got from one of the collaborators on that album that would earn MJ a fortune. The first single from the Thriller album was The Girl Is Mine. This was a duet with Beatles legend Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney had recently purchased the publishing rights to Buddy Holly's compositions to add to his growing publishing catalogue, and had told Michael how much money he'd been making and encouraged Michael to invest in publishing as well.
For a business, you ought to think about music publishing. It's because it's very good business. You love music. I'm into it. It does very well. It's a nice, easy business for a musician to be in. And it's a very rewarding business because it's music, it's songs, beautiful songs.
In the music business, there's 2 distinct and separate copyrights: the recording copyright, or master rights, and the publishing, or composition copyright. Recording copyrights are owned by record companies. Owning the master rights enables that rights holder to make copies of the recording or to sell and license use of that recording in movies, adverts, TV shows, and computer games, that sort of thing. The revenue from exploiting the recordings goes first to the rights holder, and then a portion of that revenue goes to the recording artist, depending on their contractual agreement. This can be as low as 2 or 3%, like the Jackson 5's deal with Motown, but these days it's generally around 15%, although bigger artists are often able to command a bigger share. The publishing rights are completely separate, and although some recording companies have publishing divisions, it's often the case that labels are releasing recordings of songs that are owned by other companies. When this is the case, the label has to pay a fee to the publisher for the use of the song in their recording. Publishers can also generate money by allowing songs that they control to be used in movies, adverts, and video games. The revenue from the composition is collected by the publisher, and a share of that money is paid to the writer. Much like record deals, the amount they receive is dictated by their contractual agreement, but typically publishing deals favour the writers more than recording contracts favour the artists. There's also income from performing rights. This is when a song is played publicly. This could be a live performance, a broadcast on TV or radio, or simply playing in the background of a shop, restaurant, or bar. Any business that plays music, even if it's only heard by their own staff, are required to pay for a license. These license fees are collected by performing rights organisations and distributed to their members, who are writers and publishers. The composer doesn't have to own their publishing to receive a share of the money, as they'll still get their writer's share. And if a writer has a publishing deal, then they'll get 2 lots of royalty payments derived from the composition's copyright, one from their publisher and another from the performing rights organisation. So when you hear about songwriters not owning their own publishing, it doesn't mean they don't earn any money from those songs. But owning your own publishing does have advantages. It can increase the total amount of money you get, and more importantly, gives you control over how it's used. About $9 billion a year, which is roughly a third of all the money in the music industry, comes from publishing. After learning that Paul McCartney was earning approximately $40 million every year from other people's songs, Michael Jackson wasted no time in following his new friend's advice. He bought the works of Sly and the Family Stone, Len Barry's 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
He also bought Dion DiMucci's The Wanderer and Run Around Sue, among others. In 1984, though, he made a purchase that would start a decades-long feud. Despite owning a large publishing catalogue of other writers' works, Paul McCartney didn't own the publishing rights to some of the best-known songs he'd written himself. In 1963, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, along with Beatles manager Brian Epstein and singer-turned-music publisher Dick James, formed Northern Songs Limited to publish Lennon and McCartney compositions. Lennon and McCartney would each own 20% of the new company. Epstein would own 10%, and Dick James, already an established publisher with influence in the industry, and his partner Charles Silver, would own the remaining 50%. Lennon and McCartney had thought they would be the sole owners of the company and claimed they signed the contracts without reading them properly first.
But we didn't think songs could be owned, me and John. We just thought they were in the sky. People just listened to them, you know. Well, pretty soon you had to get to know they could be owned because someone else knew they weren't in the sky. And he owned them. So that's what happened to us on the Northern Songs thing, which was me and John. Very early on, we got managed very well into a little situation. So it meant that the lion's share of whatever songs we did were taken by someone else. Actually, one guy we never even met.
In the first 2 years of Northern Songs being established, it's estimated that there were over 2,000 cover versions of various Beatles songs. This earned them so much money that Paul McCartney was paying 83% in income tax. And that could still have potentially increased, because at the time the uppermost tax rate was around 90%. In 1965, it was decided that to reduce the income tax burden, they should list the company on the stock exchange. Just over 1 million shares were issued, representing around a quarter of the company, and they were offered at 7 shillings and 6pence per share. Within minutes, all of the shares had been sold, and by the end of the week, the share price had roughly doubled. The sale of those shares earned Lennon and McCartney around £86,000 each, which is the equivalent of around £1.4 million today, when adjusted to account for inflation. When Epstein died in 1967, Lennon and McCartney began trying to renegotiate their publishing agreement with Dick James, but they failed to convince him, and relations between the writers and the publisher deteriorated. In March 1969, James and Silver sold their shares in Northern Songs to British television company Associated Television, or ATV, for £1.525 million. They didn't give Lennon or McCartney the opportunity to bid. They didn't even warn them of the intended sale.
When we went to Rishikesh with the Maharishi, the man who owned them sold them while we were out of town. Dick James, his name was. When we got back to town, we said, Dick, you can't do that. He said, you want to bet?
Now, Paul McCartney may recall being in India studying transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi when they discovered half their company had been sold. However, this trip took place in February 1968, and the sale of Northern Songs to ATV was in March 1969, which is over 1 year later. So it seems Paul McCartney's own recollection can't possibly be accurate. John Lennon would have learned of the sale while on honeymoon in Amsterdam with his second wife, Yoko Ono. The two Beatles fought for control of the publishing company, but ultimately failed, and control of Northern Songs passed to ATV. ATV offered £2.3 million to John and Paul for their remaining shares, and they initially declined to sell. But after exhausting all possibilities of controlling the company themselves, they sold their shares in October 1969 for £3.5 million. By the late 1970s, ATV's parent company, Associated Communications Corporation, or ACC, were experiencing financial difficulty due to heavy losses in their film division. In 1981, less than a year after the murder of John Lennon, his now widow Yoko Ono bid $21 million to acquire Northern Songs from ATV. The bid was declined, as then chairman Lou Grade was keen to sell ATV as a whole and had a few interested potential buyers. In January 1982, Australian billionaire Robert Holmes A. Court launched a takeover bid for ACC and successfully assumed control of the company, and with it, ATV. In September 1984, Holmes A. Court once again put ATV up for sale, and potential buyers were notified. This included Michael Jackson. Paul McCartney was also notified, but eventually declined to put in a bid.
I felt very embarrassed buying them myself because they're Lennon McCartneys. I wouldn't have liked to just own them myself. I felt bad about that. So I rang Yoko and I said, look, we got a chance to buy these songs. The man's asking 20 million, 10 to you, 10 to me. Should we do it? In fact, they didn't go for 20, they went for 50.
On November 20th, 1984, after hearing there'd been a bid for $39 million, Michael Jackson sent a bid to Holmes A. Court for $46 million. As the sale included not just the music copyrights Jackson wanted, but also some buildings, including a recording studio and some equipment, a lengthy and costly due diligence process began. The two parties began drafting contracts for the sale in January 1985, and went through 8 drafts before Michael Jackson walked away from negotiations in May 1985, having spent over $1 million just to get to that point. An agreement was reached with a rival bidder in June 1985 to sell for $50 million. But it would be a long, drawn-out process, as they would yet to even start their own due diligence. Intent on a quick sale, Holmes A. Court resumed negotiations with Jackson. Michael Jackson wasn't able to raise the full $50 million to match the rival bid, but instead offered $47.5 million and agreed to appear on the Channel 7 Perth Telethon. The deal was agreed on August 10th, 1985, and in October Jackson flew to Perth and fulfilled the contractual provision.
Michael, welcome to Perth, officially. We've had the Lord Mayor's welcome and the thousands of teenagers and youngies and oldies who gathered to see you today. You've had a pretty busy day so far.
Yes, I have.
I've got to say thank you to coming for Australia too. I think it's a fantastic effort on your part.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Everybody has been so wonderful and so kind. It's worth the trip. It's a long flight, but it's worth it.
He now owned the majority of the Beatles' publishing rights, but the publishing rights to his own songs were owned by Warner Chappell until 2012. So why exactly was Paul McCartney so upset? Well, initially, he actually wasn't. He was obviously disappointed that he couldn't purchase the catalogue for himself, but he had hoped he could use his friendship with Michael Jackson to negotiate a better deal for his writer's share, because the deal with ATV had remained on pretty much the same terms as when Northern Songs was first formed in the 1960s. However, Jackson refused to negotiate with McCartney, and the two friends just drifted apart. Matters were made even worse in 1987, when ATV, presumably with the blessing of Michael Jackson, agreed a license with Nike to use the Beatles song Revolution in a TV commercial. McCartney objected, saying that using it for adverts devalued the music.
The trouble is, like the Nike thing that came up, I don't know if you heard about that, but the trouble is that we never did do commercials with the Beatles. We had lots of big offers from soft drinks companies, you know, to do stuff, obviously, but we always thought, no, it kind of spoils it. Just takes that little edge off it that people who like Beatles stuff kind of go, Nowhere Man and Revolution. They kind of feel something for it, you know? And that was what we tried to do. That's what we were all about, was trying to resist all those commercial offers. Now, if, you know, somebody else wanted to do it, then fine, it's fine. But that's what's happening now, is our songs are tending to get a little bit commercialized now, which I'm not too wild on, because it kind of spoils them a little bit.
Now that's an understandable viewpoint, until you consider that after purchasing the rights to Buddy Holly's songs, McCartney allowed them to be used in movies, TV shows, and commercials. So he clearly wasn't concerned about spoiling those songs then.
He did commercials, Buddy, and was well into all of that. And so if any of his songs get used these days as commercials, it's with the knowledge that he would have liked it, or that his family want it, that his people want it, and they're very happy to get the money off him. So there's no objections anyway.
Now, while it's true that Buddy Holly was a progressive artist, to say that he did commercials and was well into that simply isn't true. There's no record whatsoever of Buddy Holly's music being used in TV shows, movies, or commercials until after McCartney acquired the rights. So the basis for his justification is shaky at best. By the time Sony purchased CBS Records in 1988, Jackson had earned over $470 million in combined revenue from his own music and from his ownership of ATV. Shortly after purchasing CBS Records, Sony created a publishing division, CBS Music Publishing, and began buying up smaller publishing companies and their catalogues. They spent around $35 million to acquire the 35,000 songs owned by Nashville publisher Tree International. This included the Elvis hit Heartbreak Hotel, which coincidentally Michael Jackson was sued for plagiarism of due to the Jackson song he wrote that was also called Heartbreak Hotel and eventually renamed This Place Hotel. They also purchased the rights to Tim Panelli publisher and Songwriters Hall of Famer Fred Fisher, as well as Nile Rodgers' Chic Music. They were quickly becoming a major player in music publishing, so it wasn't long before they set their sights on the biggest band of all time, the Beatles. In 1995, CBS Records, now renamed Sony Music Entertainment, offered Michael Jackson $115 million in return for a 50% stake in a new company which would be a joint venture between Sony and ATV. Jackson had been living a lavish lifestyle since the late 1980s, spending approximately $50 million each year, which was fine during his heyday when he was earning up to $100 million a year, but declining record sales and public scandals were taking their toll on his finances, so he agreed to the merger. The new company was named Sony ATV and instantly became the second largest publisher in the world. Some of you are probably now thinking, so he did own 50% of Sony. No, he actually owned 50% of a company set up by a company that Sony had purchased and then renamed. Remember, Sony is a Japanese company that made TVs, Walkmans, CD players, games consoles, computers, and countless other products. Their music division, born from the purchase of CBS Records, represented a tiny fraction of the overall corporation. Michael Jackson didn't even own 50% of Sony Music Entertainment. He was an equal co-owner of a new company with Sony. A major aspect of the myth is the notion that Jackson was a shrewd businessman that had built wealth and power through strategic investment, and it was this wealth and power that had made him a target. He was, after all, 50% co-owner of the second largest publisher on the planet, even if he wasn't actually co-owner of Sony itself. But the fact of the matter is, Michael Jackson was terrible with money. In his 2005 trial, forensic accountant John DeRoss O'Brien testified that as at June 2003, Michael Jackson had $130 million in assets, but $415 million in liabilities or debts. This meant that Jackson's net worth at that time was minus $285 million. He was, on paper at least, broke. His two main income-producing assets, the share in Sony ATV and his own MyJack Publishing, earned him about $11.5 million in 1999. But in that same year, his expenses, including payments to debts, was over $20 million. Between 1999 and 2003, that $8.5 million deficit grew to $70 million, showing that his overspending was increasing year on year. At the time of the trial in 2005, that overspend was estimated to be $24 million a year. In the late 1990s, Michael Jackson began borrowing large sums of money to support his overspending, first securing a $23 million loan against his Neverland ranch, which was about 75% of the property's valuation at the time. The loan was taken on an interest-only basis. This means the monthly payments only covered the 3.71% interest he was being charged, and none of the original amount borrowed was being repaid. At the end of the loan, he'd still owe $23 million. Now, this type of finance makes sense if you're investing the money and making more profit than you're being charged in interest. But for debt consolidation or for living expenses, it's an absolutely crazy way to raise funds. He later used his MyJack Publishing catalogue as collateral for a $24 million loan, also taken out on interest-only basis. After Jackson missed 3 payments in succession on the loan taken out on Neverland, a foreclosure notice was issued, and it seems Jackson was on the verge of losing his home. Bank of America sold the debt to Fortress Investment Group, a company that specialized in purchasing distressed loans. They would purchase bad debts held by people and organizations in financial trouble at a fraction of the balance, and then they'd try and recoup some of the debt or repossess the assets the loans were secured against. Fortress didn't foreclose on Jackson and seize Neverland. Instead, they struck a deal with Colony Capital, now known as Digital Bridge, who purchased the debt from them, and then rather than foreclosure, they started a joint venture with Jackson to turn the ranch into a public attraction. However, due to zoning restrictions that prevented the site from being open to the public, the venture failed. But it did enable Michael Jackson to keep hold of the property, even though he couldn't afford to actually live there. He also took out a line of credit loan with Bank of America, using his share in Sony ATV as the security. He initially borrowed $140 million, but by 2003 it had grown to $200 million. And by 2006 it was over $270 million. Bank of America later also sold that debt to Fortress, who charged him an eye-watering 20% interest. The monthly payments were just over $4.5 million per month, which he simply couldn't afford. His record sales had sharply declined. His previous album, Invincible, had cost over $30 million to record, making it the most expensive album of all time. But it sold just 2 million copies in its first 2 years of release, falling far short of the 25 million copies that Thriller sold and the 20 million copies that Bad sold in the first 2 years of each of those albums. In 2006, shortly after the conclusion of his trial, Michael Jackson moved to Bahrain. He'd been invited by Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Al Khalifa, the second son of the King of Bahrain. They were introduced by Michael's brother Jermaine, who had converted to Islam on a trip to Bahrain in 1989, changing his name to Mohammed Abdulaziz Sharif. Jermaine had collaborated on songs with the Bahraini prince, an avid music fan and aspiring songwriter and producer, and he put him in touch with his brother in the hope he could help his dire financial situation. Abdullah started a record label called 2Cs and built a state-of-the-art recording studio. Michael Jackson, now out of contract with Sony, was to be the first signing. As he was a novice in the music industry, Abdullah hired experienced music executive Guy Holmes to run the label. Holmes was the former head of promotions at Island Records and had also started his own label, Gut Records, in 1991. The first release, I'm Too Sexy by Right Said Fred, was an international hit.
I'm too sexy for my shirt.
In 2005, their most recent success was a cover version of a movie theme song performed by an animated frog. The first meeting between Guy Holmes and Michael Jackson didn't go well. Jackson insisted on sitting behind a cloth curtain, and Holmes left the meeting and said, "Tell him to fuck off. This is what I do for a living, not pissing about." It took 2 months to convince him to return to Bahrain and run the label. He also agreed to be Jackson's manager, a job that turned out to be much bigger than he thought. He discovered the artist was on the verge of bankruptcy, and on top of crippling debt, he also had 47 outstanding lawsuits. He was failing to make the required payments to the loans he had with Fortress, and it was looking increasingly likely he would lose control of his stake in Sony ATV. Not wanting that to happen, Sony worked with Holmes and financial advisors hired by Sheikh Abdullah to try and fix Jackson's finances. They negotiated with Fortress, who agreed to refinance the loan at a lower interest rate of 6%, provided Jackson had a suitable exit strategy in place to repay the loan in full at the end of the term, or should he be unable to continue servicing the debt. So as part of that deal, Jackson agreed to provide Sony with an option to buy half of his 50% stake in Sony ATV, which was now valued at $1 billion, for a fixed price of $250 million at any time. The refinancing of the loan also included increasing the loan amount by $30 million, giving Jackson a much-needed cash injection. With his finances in slightly better shape and some cash in the bank, Jackson abandoned the agreement with 2Cs and left Bahrain, never to return, and without completing any of the songs he'd started for the label. The Sheikh would have to sue the singer to try and recoup some of the money he'd spent, but ultimately he failed. Now maybe you think that taking out hundreds of millions of dollars in loans is pretty normal behaviour for someone regarded as the king of pop. So let's talk about the watch. This is an 18-carat white gold and diamond set watch made in 1990 by renowned Swiss watchmakers Vacheron Constantin. It's known as the King Kala. Only about 10 were ever made, and its value in the year 2000 was around $2 million. After seeing that watch at Beverly Hills jeweller David Orgel's Rodeo Drive showroom, Jackson agreed to buy the timepiece for $1.45 million, but first he wanted to test drive it for a couple of days. They agreed and let him leave with the watch without any deposit or down payments, which they said was normal when they're selling to celebrities. But 4 months later, he still hadn't returned the watch or paid for it. Eventually, after a request to settle the bill, Jackson returned the watch with a note saying he no longer wanted to buy it. However, according to court filings, the watch was returned in really poor condition. The watch, when it returned, had lotion on it, an Orgel spokesperson said at the time. The watch was scratched and it had food particles intertwined. This is a gem of a watch, and it was obviously used. Orgel sued Jackson for $1.45 million, the price of the watch, which they now deemed unsellable. They also sued for another $15,000 for other items Jackson hadn't returned. But a few days later, Orgel's lawyer filed papers to say that the matter had been settled. So evidently Jackson had agreed to make good on his promise to buy the watch. The very next day, he took out a loan from Bank of America using the watch as collateral, with the obvious conclusion being that Jackson didn't actually have the money to buy the watch, so instead had to take out a loan using the watch to pay for it. Having secured loans against all his conventional assets and barely earning enough money to pay the interest each year, he took out a loan from Royalty Advance Funding of Beverly Hills. He'd already borrowed against the publisher's share of both his own MyJack publishing company and his share of Sony ATV. Royalty Advance Funding enabled him to borrow against the writer's share, using future royalties as the collateral. He even borrowed money against his share of Kingdom Entertainment, which was a short-lived joint venture between Jackson and Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal that was supposed to build theme parks and fund tours, but it folded after it lost over $26 million, funding the first leg of Michael Jackson's history tour. By the end, Jackson was effectively not earning anything from his share in Sony ATV, as the profits were barely covering the interest he was paying on the loans he'd borrowed against his ownership. And Sony essentially controlled the entire asset by the way of their $250 million purchase option, which coincidentally was pretty much equal to the amount they had loaned Michael Jackson themselves. Given all that evidence, it's really hard to characterize Michael Jackson as a good businessman. He was anything but. The simplest way to gain control of his assets would have been to just wait. He was rapidly heading towards bankruptcy anyway. Sony were instrumental in helping Michael seal the deal with Fortress. They were so desperate to gain full control of Sony ATV. Why wouldn't they just call in the money he owed them? That would force him to sell them his share of Sony ATV to cover the cost, much like the situation with the diamond watch. Why would they help him try and stay afloat? They also didn't use their option to buy the stake as per the Fortress agreement. It wasn't until 2016 that Sony eventually bought out Jackson's estate for $750 million. Had they taken the option earlier, they could have saved at least $125 million. So in conclusion, Michael Jackson didn't own 50% of Sony or 50% of Sony Music. He owned 50% of Sony ATV, which at the time of the merger represented about 1.2% of the overall Sony corporation. And it's highly unlikely, to say the least, that his co-ownership of this joint venture had anything whatsoever to do with his death.
What do you think? Let me know in the comments and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for all the latest videos. And if you want to support the channel, there's a few ways you can do that. You can use the thanks button under each video to send a tip, or grab something from the merch shelf or store tab. There's t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags and cushions, all in a variety of colours and sizes. All profits go towards making new content and running this channel.